The Honourable Member Stuart Nash.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I stand to speak on the third reading of this bill. I've spoken first, second and committee stage on this, and I think everyone knows that this has cross-party support. It's a most important bill. It's quite an unusual reading because the bill has been divided into 5 separate bills. We've got the Financial Markets Authority Bill, Securities Amendment Bill, Securities Markets Amendment Bill, KiwiSaver Amendment Bill and Financial Advisors Amendment Bill. Mr Speaker, there is a reason for this because the bills are quite similar in their intent and it just makes a lot of sense to clump all these together because you're basically for the integrity of the legislation. The bill does set out the Financial Markets Authority and it establishes the Financial Markets Authority and sets out the wider enforcement and surveillance powers that are currently available to regulators. It also makes changes to the regulation of registered exchanges and improves the regulation of KiwiSaver schemes. Now, Mr Speaker, other members have spoken on the absolute importance that we enhance the confidence of our financial markets. A single market regulator should contribute towards this end. Labor launched the Capital Markets Development Task Force and are pleased that the government is acting on its recommendations. We are concerned about the lack of transparency around the current security commissioners, though. One thing I would like to say, Mr Speaker, is this is a bill by the Honourable Simon Power. It's a good bill and as highlighted by Simon Bridges about 2 weeks ago. I think 40% of the legislation that's passed through this House, Mr Speaker, has been passed by the Honourable Simon Power. It's a real shame that he is leaving because he appears to be the only minister in government that's actually doing any work. And there's been a lot of conjecture around why the Honourable Simon Power is leaving. I suspect, Mr Speaker, he is leaving because he is sick and tired of carrying the workload for the rest of the national government. Because if one minister, Mr Speaker, if one minister has 40% of the legislation through the House, what are the other ministers doing? In fact, when I looked through the order paper, I thought it was about 50% of the legislation that Mr Power's doing. So whether he's rushing stuff through to get it done before he leaves, or whether in fact the other ministers are just so lazy and haven't got a plan for anything that Simon Power is just doing everything. Having said that, Mr Speaker, I do note that Mr Power was the minister that put forward the plan for selling off state assets. That is a real shame, and fortunately for New Zealand, that will not be a piece of legislation that passes through this House. But I do congratulate the Honourable Member. He has done a good job with this bill and he has taken on board a lot of the recommendations from the Capital Markets Task Force. He consulted widely, I believe, with the Honourable Leanne Dalzell, and it is very much a good piece of legislation and a necessary piece of legislation, Mr Speaker. So the hard-working minister over there, I mean, you can tell he's such a hard-working minister. He's the only one that's in the House. I don't know where all the other national ministers are.
Order.
I apologise, Mr Speaker. But congratulations to Simon Power. He is a good, hard-working minister, and I'm sure the National Party will be sad to see him go because he really is the only one that's carrying the can and the only one that seems to have a plan around certain areas. Now, Mr Speaker, Labor does support this bill, and as mentioned, it establishes the Financial Markets Authority, and in principle, we support the idea of consolidating all the different regulatory bodies into a single agency. The concentration of power in the hands of the FMA, which is the Financial Markets Authority, means that all its officers must be beyond reproach and its processes must be fully transparent. I think that is something that has been really demanded by the people of New Zealand, a much higher level of transparency. The integrity of the markets depends upon the integrity of the Financial Markets Authority and its personnel. And this is especially true and most important as our financial markets, I believe, are still struggling under the perception that cowboys and crooks run the show. This is hopefully no longer true, Mr Speaker, and I think a lot of these have been weeded out. But it's up to the FMA to act in a way that totally dispels that over time. And I know it's a cliche, but the proof of the pudding is in the eating, as they say. And the FMA has a very important task in actually developing or letting the confidence return to our financial markets if we're actually to grow as a country and deepen our capital markets. Now, Labor started the financial markets reform process, and we're pleased, as mentioned, that the government is actually continuing this work, Mr Speaker. As mentioned, Leanne Dalzell actually set up the Capital Markets Development Task Force in 2008, And this was in order to develop a blueprint and an action plan for the development of our financial system. We are pleased the government is starting to act on the recommendations in the task force's report, one of which was a single market regulator. And Mr. Speaker, I could go through a number of measures that the Labor government put in place or recommended that this bill actually picks up. But the whole process was actually accelerated by the global financial crisis and the spate of finance company collapses. And Mr. Speaker, I think that is up to 61 collapses now. It's quite astounding to think there are even 61 finance companies in the country, but 61 finance companies have collapsed. And I've spoken about the consequences of these finance company collapses in this House many times, and certainly of the consequences this has had on a number of New Zealanders who have lost their life savings. Some of the stories are diabolical, some of them are incredibly sad, Mr. Speaker, and in fact we're still dealing with the fallout. South Canterbury Finance looks like it may end up costing the taxpayers well over $1 billion. Some say up to $1.6 billion, Mr. Speaker. And there's a widely held belief that if in fact the government had managed this process properly, then it wouldn't have needed to be so high at all. But there's about $1.6 billion that the South Canterbury Finance will end up costing the taxpayers. Now, Labor's view on the Financial Markets Authority is that it's about enforceable principles such as integrity, skill, reasonable care and financial prudence that are needed. Principles are flexible. Now, unlike rigid rules which are made to be broken, it's important that the ethics that underpin the new regime will help rebuild the trust and the confidence in the financial sector, which is so important in terms of developing our capital markets and our financial markets as well. This bill gives the FMA new powers that were never available under the Securities Commission, including the ability to take action against directors they believe have acted illegally when it is in the public interest. And that is the most important point. It's about what's in the public interest. And as well as the power to seek search warrants, raid officers and seize documents. This is not about an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. This is getting to the nub of the issue and solving the problems before they become another South Canterbury Finance and cost us about $1 billion or more. The removal of the New Zealand Exchange's regulatory role is sensible. While there may never have been an actual conflict of interest, the NZX's dual commercial and regulatory roles have created the appearance of a conflict of interest. And as mentioned, Mr. Speaker, this is a lot about perception and appearances. What we need to do is create an environment where the people of New Zealand actually have trust in the people who are controlling these markets and regulating these markets. Regulators have attracted some blame for recent troubles in our financial markets, and we believe it is necessary to reshape New Zealand's regulatory environment. The FMA will have powers to require that warnings about financial products and providers be included in offer documents and be published by the people involved. This provides investors with information required to make sound decisions. Now, this is most important, Mr. Speaker, because I remember a piece of legislation that was passed in the first sort of 6 months, I think, which actually stripped away a lot of the information that needed to be required in prospectuses in order to raise funds from the public. And I had major reservations about that because I believe that there needs to be as much information as possible in a prospectus that allows the general public to make an informed decision. The bill actually contains many far-reaching powers, and this underscores the importance of its transparency and rigour. Now, Mr. Speaker, as mentioned, this is a very important piece of legislation, and Labor is backing it wholeheartedly. But there is one thing I would like to see, Mr. Speaker. I would like to see more robust legislation in this House that actually showed the government had a plan in areas outside of the portfolios that the Honourable Simon Power manages. And Mr. Speaker, I have not seen an economic plan that will allow the development of our capital markets. I have not seen any sort of plan whatsoever that will in fact encourage the development of our financial markets or our financial sector. So, Mr. Speaker, the only conclusion I can come to is the government actually has no plan. And if mining national parks and selling state assets is their idea of a plan, then New Zealanders need to be very, very worried because, Mr Speaker, the government over there actually has no plan whatsoever for economic growth or job creation. Mr Speaker, I commend this bill to the House. Thank you very much.
I call the honourable member Jonathan Young.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.